This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
The United Nations Food Programme says at least 850 million people worldwide are hungry.
The rains didn't come, so the crops didn't grow. People are starving and desperate.
Famine has struck the remote farmlands of rural Ethiopia. Prices of food are now at record levels, and few have the money to pay.
Famine, starvation and hunger have existed in every era in history, including our own.
In the Horn of Africa, a deadly cocktail of successive droughts, armed conflicts and rising food prices has put the most vulnerable at risk.
We risk again the spectre of widespread hunger, malnutrition and social unrest on an unprecedented scale.
And similar to many famine-ravaged countries in our modern world, especially in Africa, in the mid-19th century, between 1845 and 1850, Ireland experienced a great hunger unlike any famine, food crisis or natural disaster she'd ever witnessed before.
It has become a very general belief that the month of December will not find a single potato in the country. Ireland is, therefore, doomed to suffer a recurrence, if it should not rather be called a continuance, of that distress which has well nigh pauperized the whole population.
In parts of Mayo which I visited, the failure of the potato is complete, and the destruction of the cottier population is total. They have nothing.
The distress we saw in Cleggan was appalling, far beyond my power of description. I was quickly surrounded by a mob of men and women, more like famished dogs than fellow creatures, whose figures, looks and cries all showed that they were suffering the ravaging agony of hunger.
However, in the midst of Ireland's darkest hour during the mid-19th century, when over 1 million Irish people starved to death, there was one small group of individuals who were not prepared to stand idly by while Irish people died of hunger. They were called the Quakers, and this is their story.
They knew something had to be done, and they did it in a practical way.
Certainly there were people who put their necks on the line.
It was a horrific time in Ireland. It was very, very sad. These people were really put their money where their hearts were.
They knew after a time that their health was suffering, and yet they kept going.
They saw other human beings who were desperate, who needed help.
It's a story showing that always there are good people, and that good people actually are effective.
They certainly were determined people, and I suppose in their own quiet way they were heroes.
If they hadn't done that work, thousands more would have died.
There must have been significant numbers of people who didn't die because of what they did.
They tried to do the greatest amount of good.
When the potato crop failed in the autumn of 1846, Quakers in Ireland and Britain could see there were many people who wanted to try help alleviate Irish suffering, but just didn't know how. Thus they set up various famine relief committees, the most important being the Central Relief Committee based in Dublin, to provide a suitable channel through which contributions of time, food and money could be combined and brought to many Irish people desperately in need. We'll hear more about the origins and vital work of the Quakers Central Relief Committee in a short while. But first, here's historian Willie Whelan to explain how blight affected the potato crop in the mid-1840s.
The potatoes effectively rotted in the ground, for want of a better description, and became unedible. Even there was 1 or 2 experiments conducted in the early years of methodologies of making these blight-ridden potatoes edible. They tried to powder them and do various types of things with them, but they never did. Just once blight struck the potato crop, that was it. It was all up. It was unedible, and it was effectively you dug them out of the place, and that was it. They were no good for anything.
The curse of death is in the air. It falls on Erin's children fair. for breath that once gave them life is now a word for hunger and strife.
And given the fact that at least 1/3 of Ireland's population were solely dependent on the potato for survival, the total failure of the potato crop in 1846 spelled disaster and starvation for many. Indeed, by the autumn of 1846, people throughout the land were dying by the roadsides in their thousands. County Waterford local historian John Young explains what occurred in the County Waterford townland of Clashmore during this horrendous period.
On the road to Clashmore, Clashmore is a small little village about 15 miles from here. And on the 26th of September 1846, the whole population of the village were eating grass and leaves and blackberries. That's all they had to eat. But the ranger from the workhouse went out, they'd have an overseer or whatever you want to call him. He went out and he found a mother and she feeding the baby blades of grass. And on his way to Clashmore he observed that. And on his way back, the two of them were huddled in death. A mother and baby. Is that terrible?
So how did the official British government react to the immense disaster now engulfing Ireland? Connemara historian Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle.
The reaction of the government was simply disbelief. They felt, I think in many cases they felt, oh well, we've heard this from Ireland before. They're always starving in Ireland. So there was that element of it. There was of course a huge element that believed that the Catholics of Ireland deserved what they were getting because they didn't conform to the Protestant faith. That was a huge ideology among many of them. But on the other side, there were an awful lot of very good individuals who sent an awful lot of money who saved the people. But we're talking strictly about the government. The government just fell down very badly on a job. They didn't rise to it. They didn't believe it. They didn't know how to deal with it. And they certainly never made any huge effort to investigate it.
Skeletons lie across the land, scattered there by hunger's hand. No wail of family lament their loss, no friend to own them or count the cost.
But disbelief and misunderstanding lay not only with the British government. In the early days of the crisis, many people, especially in England, actually believed that accounts of Irish famine in the newspapers were exaggerated. Rob Goodbody, historian and also author of the book A Suitable Channel, Quaker Relief in the Great Famine.
Certainly in Great Britain and abroad, there was a general belief that, well, it's just this always happens. There's always famines in Ireland. Sure, why is this one any different? And just getting hard information out was what was required, particularly as the worst hit areas would have been the areas which were more remote, and therefore fewer journalists were experiencing it, and there were fewer people who could spread the information abroad with hard information about what was actually happening.
It's like in today's world that some areas would be more destitute than others.
County Waterford local historian Joan Johnson.
And there would be food in some stores, and some places would be okay. And then there'd be a spin on that and they'd say, oh no, that area is fine, there's no famine there.
And realising there was much confusion on the ground concerning the extent of the crisis, English and Irish Quakers in the autumn of 1846 undertook extensive fact-finding missions to find out the truth. Their graphic reports immediately dispelled any illusions that talk of Irish famine was overblown. The work of a young Quaker man called William Edward Forster was especially important in getting the truth of Irish suffering communicated to a wider general public, especially in Forster's native England. Rob Goodbody.
It started with a young Quaker, William E. Foster, who came over to Ireland to check out for himself, went over to the West, and he reported back to Quakers in England of what he was seeing.
Bad as were my expectations, the reality far exceeded them. there is a prevailing idea in England that the newspaper accounts are exaggerated. Particular cases may or may not be coloured, but no colouring can deepen the blackness of the truth.
The Quakers went out and they really saw and got the first-hand accounts, really, and that was the key to it, really.
Historian Joan Johnson.
People listened then and sat up. I mean, I read a piece about Foster coming down here from Westport, and he wrote down his thoughts, and he really gave it so much in one of his reports, and really appealed to the Quakers and the society outside to really try and get things moving, that things were so bad out here.
The distress we saw in Cleggan was appalling, far beyond my power of description. I was quickly surrounded by a mob of men and women more like famished dogs than fellow creatures, whose figures, looks and cries all showed that they were suffering the ravaging agony of hunger.
Definitely when the Quakers came to view and to report for themselves and to see the conditions on the ground themselves, and once they started to report back, very, very good detailed reports of conditions prior to the famine, the conditions of people at the famine, and possible, ways of remedying their situation. And their reports were published.
Connemara historian Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle.
And at that time they created a great stir. Also, immediately afterwards they were followed by journalists who came in then and started to investigate and report. But even today, the Quaker reports are the reports that those of us who are writing history or commenting on history will go back to read and to see what conditions were truly like. They were very, very vivid descriptions of what conditions were like at the time.
We entered the cabin, stretched in one dark corner, scarcely visible from the smoke and rags that covered them, were 3 children huddled together, lying there because they were too weak to rise, pale and ghastly, with their little limbs. On removing a portion of a filthy covering, we saw that they were perfectly emaciated, with eyes sunk, voice gone, and evidently in the last stage of actual starvation. Many cases were widows whose husbands had recently been taken by the fever, and their only pittance, obtained from the public works, entirely cut off.
And when William Edward Forster, James Duke and their colleagues returned back to England after their fact-finding missions in the famine-ravaged west of Ireland, they immediately reported to English Quakers just how bad things really were. In consequence, English Quakers decided to make contact with Quakers in Dublin, with the aim of organising effective famine relief. The group which the English Quakers made contact with was the Dublin-based Central Relief Committee, which had been established by Irish Quakers to try alleviate suffering caused by the famine. Historian Joan Johnson explains its roots.
This originated on the 13th of November 1846 in Eustace Street in Dublin, when some Irish Quakers, concerned Irish Quakers, called a meeting, and they set up the Quaker Central Relief Committee. This was to coordinate the huge relief that was to come. They had no idea what they were actually entering into, but they set up a committee, and they had 21 committee members.
And so in November 1846, the Central Relief Committee was founded, and among its ranks of 21 committee members were many prominent Quaker businessmen, such as Jonathon Pim, Joseph Bewley and James Perry. The committee members could see there were many people in Ireland, England and the United States who wanted to do something to help, but just didn't know how. They decided to devise a national relief strategy and provide a suitable channel through which contributions of food and money from all over the world, and also time and effort, could be combined to get practical help to those who needed it most. In their address to their English counterpart, the London Relief Committee, they went to pains to explain the difference between the misery in Ireland and support for the poor in England.
For those whose dependence was on this crop and who have no money to buy other food, the failure of the potato is necessarily the failure of all, and must, if timely aid not to be supplied, produce starvation. What is this but famine to this class of people, who form, be it remembered, in some parts, the entire population of the district, and not like the poor in England, with neighbours in wealthy and in easy circumstances interspersed among them, and ready to hold out the hand of help.
The Central Relief Committee was made up of very ordinary people who had little or no experience in famine relief work. While they were highly motivated by feelings for fellow human beings and by a spirit of God within, nevertheless, they possessed no prior experience in large-scale famine relief. The idea was that they would bridge the gap between those on the one hand who wanted to help financially, and on the other, the enormity of the destitution in the afflicted areas.
However, resolving to do this was one thing, implementing it was quite another. So just how did the Central Relief Committee go about its task? Joan Johnson.
A number of these people went out onto the ground, visited the priests, visited the local landlords, visited the workhouses to get the information as to what was needed. So they went on investigative tours or got the information.
Who would these people have been now, Joan?
Well, we had Jonathon Pim went, who was one of the co-secretaries. There was Joseph Bewley. There was Goodbody's, Perry's, the names are legendary, Webb. They went out and filtered through. So there was about 6 or 10 of them that went out and came back.
Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, those brave few souls answering needs. I sing of the Quaker Relief Committee, known to most as the CRC.
And before the Central Relief Committee could effect any short-term relief such as soup kitchens and distribution of clothing, or any long-term relief strategies in the form of seed distribution, as well as assistance to fisheries, agriculture and industry, well, first vital monies were required. Rob Goodbody.
In the first instance, they were collecting from amongst their own Quaker communities in Dublin and in London, but they would have realised immediately that this wasn't going to be enough, and they needed to go further afield to go on a campaign of fundraising. So this was done, and a lot of emphasis was with the London Committee, because obviously in Ireland there'd be a much higher profile of what was happening. People would have known, and people would have already been donating. But the idea was to tap into England and not just the Quaker community, but going beyond that to try and fire the people of England in general, and of course not forgetting Scotland and Wales, but a lot of it would have been England, to fire them with enthusiasm for donating money, food, clothing, but particularly money.
They were the few, this is their song, who gave their all to right or wrong, that future generations might know about those who cared for Erin's woe.
And one of the key ways which the Quaker Central Relief Committee and also the London Famine Relief Committee used to fire donor enthusiasm in England and elsewhere was through the publication of reports written by James Tuke and William Edward Forster, as we heard earlier. The Quakers London Relief Committee also wrote to Quakers in North America, telling how London and Dublin committees had been set up, and that the Dublin Committee was now operating an efficient system for famine relief distribution. The London Committee's letter ended with a brief and direct plea.
We hear that you have, during the past year, been blessed with fruitful harvests in many parts of your continent, and we wish, in thus communicating with you, not only to enlist your sympathies, but to open the way for your cooperation, and to invite you, in the exercise of that enlarged commiseration which you doubtless feel, to aid us in this work by the supply of either food or money, as you may think fit.
Also, a New York-based Quaker named Jacob Harvey played a key role in raising awareness of the Irish famine in the United States, and also spearheading fundraising efforts there. Historian Rob Goodbody.
Once they tapped into the United States, then Jacob Harvey on that side of the Atlantic used the Quaker community to get out to anyone out there who could be persuaded to donate of whatever form. So the principal sources would have been, to some extent, Ireland, to a good extent Britain, and hugely from the United States. Now, there would have been money coming in from other parts of the world as well, but that would have been fairly minor in comparison with what was coming in from the United States and from England.
A huge amount of American aid from right across the country. Now, this wasn't all Quaker.
Historian Joan Johnson once again.
But what happened was, for some reason, the people in America felt safe by giving the donations to a Quaker committee, the Central Relief Committee. And in the end, I mean, it was a massive relief work, far bigger than they thought. It just snowballed. I mean, for example, I think there was 91 ships came from America full of food. And that was organised from there by Jacob Harvey.
Quakers were renowned for their probity with money. Any claims of corruption, which were very few, were thoroughly investigated. The general public's perception was that the Quakers ran a good shop.
Donations came from a lot from the Irish that had been out there, that knew relations back here, wanted their money to be sent in and directed safely and not siphoned off in any way, and they felt it was in safe hands with the Quakers.
And we'll talk about what aid was given in a short while. But first, we need to ask what were the key elements to the Central Relief Committee's effectivity. County Laois local historian Ger Lynch.
People knew, if it dealt with the Quakers, they were going to get a fair deal and everything would be straight and above board. And while, you wouldn't do anything wrong on them, they certainly wouldn't do anything wrong on you, and that was their philosophy, that they dealt with people fairly and squarely.
Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, those brave few souls answering needs. I sing of the Quaker Relief Committee, known to most as the CRC.
And another vital factor to the Central Relief Committee's success was its utilisation of already established networks and alliances.
Many Quaker families throughout Ireland were successfully established merchants, traders and business people who'd built up large business networks and alliances through intermarriage and commerce throughout the length and breadth of Ireland, with the exception of Connaught, where there were no Quaker settlements. Distribution of goods was a core ingredient of their daily work lives ever before the famine erupted. It was these already established networks and alliances which the Central Relief Committee and various Quakers used to great effect in getting aid to where it was required.
But perhaps the biggest reason behind the Central Relief Committee's effectivity was the fact it included in its ranks some of the top businessmen of mid-19th century Dublin. who operated large, successful commercial enterprises employing many people. We're talking about successful businessmen such as Joseph Bewley, Jonathon Pim, James Purry and others. Historian Rob Goodbody.
There was some very successful businessmen out there in the merchant class amongst the Quaker community, and that was absolutely critical to the whole running of the Central Relief Committee, because these were people who could purchase goods somewhere abroad or wherever. They could move those goods from A to B and they could distribute them, and they knew how to do it, they knew how to keep their accounts, they knew how to run the operations efficiently, so there was very little learning curve. This was what they did as a daily living, and merely the fact that they were doing it as part of a relief operation was very little different.
But the difference was in this case, they were, instead of the end target being to save money, so to speak, they were actually saving lives.
Exactly, yeah. But of course they would do their best to save money along the way, because the less it costs to do anything, the more relief you can give to people.
And with various funding and support received from Quakers and non-Quakers worldwide, the Central Relief Committee adopted a twofold approach to provide effective famine relief. The first was short-term relief in the form of soup kitchens and distribution of clothing. The second was various long-term relief strategies, such as assistance to fisheries, agriculture and industry. Now, dealing first with the short-term relief strategy of soup kitchens, the Central Relief Committee, knowing that the number of Quakers in Ireland was quite small, 3,000 in total, decided to adopt a very pragmatic approach. Rob Goodbody.
We're talking about a very small society who are still trying to run their own daily lives and their daily work and whatever. They were not full-time on this. So what they did was to identify people who were running soup kitchens or distributing food in whatever way and pass it on to them. So what they did was they made contact with people in all parts of the country who were maybe already had soup kitchens or some form of food distribution going, or people who areas where there wasn't anybody. They tried to encourage local members of the gentry, the landowners, the clergy, whoever, to set up relief operations locally.
The Central Relief Committee decided that the most effective way to distribute relief was to utilise local Quakers living in the area to help out. Where there were no Quakers in an area, which was the norm rather than the exception, they utilised reputable local people of all creeds and backgrounds to dispense relief prudently provided by them.
And to discover just how effective the Quaker Central Relief Committee's soup kitchen relief measures were in feeding thousands of starving Irish during the horrendous famine years, then make sure to catch our next number 2 programme in this 9-part Giving the Greatest Good series. This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Songs by Cliff Wedgbury. From myself, Paul Wright. Bye for now.
Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, those brave few souls answering needs. I sing of the Quaker Relief Committee, known to most as the CRC. They were the few, this is their song, who gave their all to right a wrong, that future generations might know about those who cared for Erin's woe. Yes, I sing of them who strove to save countless innocents from the grave. Soup kitchens, clothing, agri-relief, they gave so much to ease the grief. They were the few, this is their song, who gave their all to right a wrong, that future generations might know about those who cared for Erin's woe. I see them now, brave warriors of light, against famine's horror, fighting the fight. Joseph Bewley's endless giving to help those barely living. On Mount Mellick's son, Joseph Beale, working to give subsidized meals.